For his 55th birthday, President Herbert Hoover received a possum. Yes, a real live possum. He was given said possum by an 11-year-old boy named Ray Burraker, who lived in an area called Dark Hollow in what is today Shenandoah National Park. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, was there. This all took place at Hoover's presidential retreat Rapidan camp, but the boy didn't know who he was. In fact, Ray Burraker had never even been to school, nor had any of his 8 brothers and sisters, or many of the other children who lived in this area. So, upon receipt of this possum, President Herbert Hoover raised the funds to build Burraker and his siblings a school. It was to be a one-room schoolhouse with classes conducted by Miss Christine Vest, who had experience with teaching in remote mountain communities. The students, and sometimes their parents, learned reading, writing, and arithmetic. They learned how to sew clothes, they learned how to count money, they even went to the White House, where they were hosted by Herbert Hoover. The school was incredibly valuable to this mountain community, providing them with the skills and knowledge they otherwise wouldn't have had. But it was only open for 5 years. It closed in 1935 after the blanket condemnation of more than 3,000 parcels forced families like the Burrakers off their land to create Shenandoah National Park. I'm telling you all of this because in the early days of Shenandoah, park leaders and promoters would have you believe that families like the Burrakers didn't exist. They promoted the idea and maybe even believed it themselves that these mountains were a pristine wilderness, untouched by the hands of man, that it was just waiting there to be turned into a national park. But as we'll see, that couldn't have been further from the truth. The truth is that the history of Shenandoah National Park is completely interwoven with the people of these mountains. It's a history that's full of contradictions and injustices and forces us to look ourselves right in the eyes and grapple with some very difficult questions. My name is Cameron, this is National Park Diaries. Today, I'm telling you the story of the impossible park, Shenandoah. If you like parks and want to learn more about them, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. I put these things up pretty regularly so you can learn all about parks and protected areas with me, and I really do appreciate your support. I also need to thank the sponsor of this video very quickly, Blinkist. Blinkist has a library of more than 5,000 nonfiction titles in 27 different categories, and basically they just pull out the key takeaways and ideas and put them into short 15-minute text and audio explainers. You guys know how much I love an explainer. You're watching one right now. You also probably know that I'm a big reader. That's just a small sample of my overall collection. So I love using Blinkist. They help me understand powerful ideas quickly. Of course, I'm naturally drawn to the nature and environment section because that's pretty much all I read these days. I recently finished Suzanne Simard's book, Finding the Mother Tree. It's all about hidden connections between trees and forest intelligence, and it's wonderful, and there's a blink for it. Just like there's a blink for lots of other books, and if you love reading and learning about new things like I do, you should probably check out Blinkist. Oh, and they have this new feature called Blinkist Connect, where you can share your premium membership with another person and essentially get a 2-for-1 deal. You can share your blinks with each other and add your own thoughts and comments so you can learn about the titles together. You can get a 7-day free trial and 25% off a premium subscription by using the link in my description. Supporting my sponsors helps me tell more stories on this channel. So thank you again to Blinkist, and now back to Shenandoah. So the history of human settlement in Shenandoah goes back a long time, like 11,000 years at the earliest. And it's probably longer, honestly. There are other studies and evidence out there to suggest this. Big Meadows, one of the areas of the park most associated with human development, has been occupied for something like 4,000 years. Tribes like the Monacan and Manahoac have been here for thousands of years as well. Europeans first visited this area in the 17th century, and they've been here ever since. They adopted plantation agriculture, including the use of slaves. They've mined here, logged here, they've traded goods, fought wars, and in general, have made their mark on this landscape. Now, I know I just breezed through like several thousand years of human history, but I wanted to give you the scale and diversity of the people who have lived here over the years. You've had Native Americans, Europeans, and Africans, rich and poor, homeowners, renters and squatters, tradesmen, laborers, merchants, you get the point. People of all shapes and sizes have been in the Shenandoah area for a very long time, which is why I'm confused that early park leaders and proponents thought of this land as a pristine wilderness. Take Hubert Work, Secretary of the Interior from 1923 to 1928. He said at a state parks conference in 1925, quote, "Here in the Blue Ridge of Virginia, in the very heart of civilized America, lies preserved for our use a bit of nature that is identical with the virgin territory found by Captain John Smith and his heroic followers. Its very inaccessibility has kept it intact, and in the hurried distractions of modern life, your forefathers have not had the time to conquer this wilderness, which is one of the few remaining in the East." I mean, it's incredible that he compares Shenandoah in the 1920s to the virgin territory seen by John Smith, who came to Virginia in 1607. There's literally like 300 years of human history in between, not to mention the Native American history before that. But understanding that this was the thought process early leaders were working from helps you understand the rest of this story. See, national parks at this time were created largely for their scenic value. Today, we manage parks for much more than that. We've learned so much about the interconnectedness of ecosystems and the value of historic and cultural preservation, and parks today are managed accordingly. But places like Yellowstone and Yosemite and the Grand Canyon were preserved for people to come and explore their rugged, wild beauty. They were envisioned as places where people could escape city crowds and retreat to the solitude of beautiful natural places. They were scenic retreats. But Yellowstone and Yosemite and the Grand Canyon and many of our early national parks were all located in the West. The people who were going to visit them, who were seeking that wilderness retreat, were mostly coming from the East. That's where most people lived. Shenandoah leaders wanted to change this. They wanted to bring a Western-style park experience to the East. To them, armed with this idea of an untouched, John Smith-inspired wilderness, Shenandoah made perfect sense. It was within a day's travel of a large portion of the US population. It was especially close to the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., which increased the likelihood of Eastern political support, and it was an excellent example of Southern Appalachian scenery. It had a lot of things going for it. Except, all that land within the proposed park boundary was privately owned. Every single acre. In order to create a national park here, all that acreage would have to be acquired, bought. Shenandoah would have to be purchased. Keep in mind too that this is unprecedented in the history of national parks in the United States. Again, all national parks prior to this were created out west, where the federal government already owned large chunks of land, or in the case of Acadia, land was donated. Never before had a national park been bought. The federal government also had a precedent at this time of not appropriating funds for land acquisition in the case of national parks. So if Shenandoah leaders, and Great Smokies actually, they were going through this thing at the same time, if they wanted a park, they would have to find some way to acquire hundreds of thousands of acres of privately owned land. Then they'd have to donate to the federal government to form a national park. As you can imagine, that was not easy. Early leaders called Shenandoah the impossible park. Land costs money, and lots of land cost lots of money. And also, people didn't want to sell their land. They didn't think it was pristine or untouched, it was their home. The state of Virginia, though, didn't really see it that way. This was a pride thing. They wanted a national park in their state. They actually passed a blanket condemnation law to acquire parkland. Essentially, this meant that instead of taking each individual landowner to court for condemnation proceedings, they could lump all the parcels in a single county into a single court case. There were 8 Shenandoah counties, meaning thousands of condemnation proceedings and thousands of potential roadblocks were reduced to just 8. Understandably, the people of the future Shenandoah National Park were not happy with this arrangement. They had lives and homes and families here, despite what the park leaders may have thought. They fought the condemnation law all the way to the US Supreme Court, but they lost. The land was condemned, acquired by the state of Virginia, and donated to the federal government. Shenandoah National Park was officially dedicated on July 3rd, 1936. But that's just kind of like half the story. Remember, park leaders were pushing Shenandoah as a primeval wilderness, so they had to make it look that way. The burning and the clearing and the planting wasn't going to fly in a park marketed as unspoiled. So they undertook a program of essentially covering up the evidence of prior human settlement. This was during the CCC era too, so thousands of young men were sent out into Shenandoah to plant thousands of trees, which over time would recolonize the burned areas and the clearings and the homesteads. They also destroyed and dismantled the homes and buildings of the previous landowners. In some areas, certain species of trees were planted simply because they looked better. They placed massive boulders along the road for the same reason. They increased the scenic value. And I hope the irony of this isn't lost on you. In order to create a landscape devoid of human influence, park leaders enlisted thousands of humans whose influence was just as much, if not more than, their predecessors. I mean, take Skyline Drive. It's been called Shenandoah's single greatest feature, but it's a feature built for humans by humans. The pullouts and vistas that you see as you drive along it are maintained to protect views. They literally plant different types of vegetation at different heights to improve your view of the valleys below. Early park proponents, the ones making these decisions, were operating under a singular vision of what a park should be, modeled after those in the West. This is the myth of the Shenandoah Wilderness. It's not this unspoiled land untouched since the days of John Smith. It's an area steeped in human history and human influence, both before the park and after its establishment. The people who have called this land home have formed it and shaped it according to their needs. And telling the full story of Shenandoah National Park requires telling their story as well. Which, to their credit, the Park Service does now do. There are resources online and at the park which help to interpret the vast and diverse human history of Shenandoah. I've linked some down below. I'd also be curious to know your thoughts on the Shenandoah Wilderness. Does this history change your perception of the park? I know it certainly did mine. Let me know in the comments down below. You can also check out my Patreon. I posted some tips and advice on how to visit Shenandoah not too long ago, as I do with all my park visits on there. I also posted some pictures of my trip over on Instagram, so go follow me there, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.